Good evening all and welcome back to Untold Fears. Tonight we venture into the heart of America's most haunted region, where ancient mountains guard secrets that local families have whispered about for generations. These are not the sanitized legends you read in tourist brochures, but 10 documented accounts of real people who encountered something in those deep woods that forever changed their understanding of what lurks beyond the safety of civilization. From hikers who vanished without explanation to residents who discovered their neighbors harbored unspeakable darkness, these stories emerged from police reports, missing person files, and first-hand testimonies of survivors who managed to escape the mountains with their lives intact. Each account takes place in the remote hollers and forgotten trails where cell phone signals fail and the nearest help is miles away through terrain that seems determined to keep its secrets buried. If you're new here, make sure to subscribe to Untold Fears for daily true horror content that will keep you up at night. Hit that notification bell so you never miss when the darkness calls. Now, let us step into the shadows of the Appalachian deep woods, where civilization ends and terror begins. My name is Jaelyn Martinez, and 3 years ago, I thought I understood the wilderness of West Virginia. I had been hiking the Appalachian Trail section that runs through the Monongahela National Forest for the better part of a decade, usually solo trips lasting 4 to 5 days at a time. At 28, I was in the best shape of my life, carried proper equipment, and had emergency protocols that I followed religiously. My friends used to joke that I was more comfortable sleeping in my tent than in my own bed back in Charleston. They were probably right. The mountains felt like home to me in a way that no apartment or house ever had. But after what happened during my October 2022 trip, I have not returned to those woods, and I do not think I ever will again. I had planned a 4-day solo backpacking trip along a remote section of trail that runs between Spruce Knob and Seneca Rocks. This particular stretch is not heavily trafficked, especially in late October, when most casual hikers have already packed away their gear for the season. The forecast called for clear skies and temperatures in the 50s during the day, dropping to the 30s at night. Perfect hiking weather, as far as I was concerned. I started my trek on a Thursday morning, parking my Subaru at the Spruce Knob trailhead around 7 in the morning. The parking area was completely empty except for one other vehicle, an older Ford pickup truck with West Virginia plates that looked like it had been there for several days based on the leaves accumulated on the windshield. The first day of hiking went exactly as planned. I covered about 12 miles, stopping at all my usual waypoints and taking pictures of the fall foliage, which was absolutely spectacular that year. The maples and oaks had turned brilliant shades of orange and red, while the hickories added splashes of golden yellow throughout the forest canopy. I made camp at a designated backcountry site just after 6 in the evening, cooked myself a simple dinner of dehydrated beef stroganoff, and settled in for what I expected to be a peaceful night under the stars. The temperature dropped faster than the forecast had predicted, and by midnight I could see my breath inside my tent, but I had experienced much worse conditions and slept soundly until dawn. Friday morning brought an unexpected change in the atmosphere of the forest. As I broke camp and prepared to continue deeper into the wilderness, I noticed that the usual sounds of the woods had become strangely muted. No bird song echoed through the trees, no squirrels chattered in the branches overhead, and even the constant rustling of small creatures moving through the underbrush had gone completely silent. I attributed this to the cold snap and continued on my planned route, though I found myself stopping more frequently to listen for any signs of life around me. The silence was so complete that I could hear my own heartbeat as I walked. About 3 miles into the second day, I came across something that made me stop dead in my tracks. Carved into the bark of a massive oak tree about 7 feet off the ground were symbols that I had never seen before. They were not random scratches or natural marks caused by animals or weather. These were deliberate, precise carvings that formed a pattern of interconnected triangles and circles, with what appeared to be some kind of writing or script running vertically along the center. The cuts were deep enough that they had obviously been made with a sharp blade, but the edges of the carvings showed signs of weathering that suggested they had been there for months, possibly even years. I took several photographs of the markings with my phone and made note of the GPS coordinates before continuing on my way. Over the next few hours, I discovered similar carvings on at least 6 more trees, all at roughly the same height, and all featuring variations of the same triangular and circular patterns. What disturbed me most was that these symbols appeared to form a deliberate trail of their own, leading away from the official hiking path and deeper into an area of the forest that was not covered by any of my topographical maps. The markings seemed to be pointing toward a section of the wilderness that was so remote and inaccessible that it did not appear on any official trail guides or Park Service documentation. As afternoon turned to evening, I began to notice other signs that someone had been moving through this area recently. Broken branches at chest height, footprints in muddy sections of the trail that were clearly too large to be mine, and most unsettling of all, pieces of fabric caught on thorns and branches that did not match any of my own gear. The fabric appeared to be from outdoor clothing, the kind of technical material that serious hikers and backpackers wear, but it was faded and weathered in a way that suggested it had been hanging there for quite some time. I collected several of these fabric samples and stored them in a Ziploc bag, though at the time I was not sure why I felt compelled to preserve them as evidence. That night, I camped at another designated backcountry site, but sleep did not come easily. Around 2 in the morning, I was awakened by what sounded like voices calling out in the distance. The calls were too far away and too distorted by the wind for me to make out any actual words, but there was definitely a human quality to the sounds. They seemed to be coming from the direction where I had seen the tree carvings earlier in the day. I lay in my sleeping bag for nearly an hour, listening to these distant calls and trying to decide whether I should investigate or ignore them. Eventually, the sound stopped, and I managed to fall back asleep, though I kept my flashlight and emergency whistle within easy reach for the rest of the night. Saturday morning brought the discovery that would haunt me for months afterward. About a quarter mile from my campsite, hidden behind a cluster of rhododendron bushes, I found what appeared to be an abandoned campsite. But this was not a normal backcountry camp. Someone had constructed an elaborate shelter using branches, tarps, and rope, creating a structure that was clearly meant for long-term habitation rather than a temporary overnight stay. The shelter was large enough to accommodate several people and had been carefully camouflaged so that it was almost invisible from the main trail. Inside the shelter, I found evidence that it had been occupied recently. There were sleeping bags, camping equipment, and personal items scattered throughout the space. Most disturbing of all, I discovered a collection of photographs pinned to one wall of the shelter. These were not nature photos or family snapshots, but surveillance-style images of hikers on various sections of the Appalachian Trail. The photographs appeared to have been taken with a telephoto lens from concealed positions, showing solo hikers who were clearly unaware that they were being watched and documented. Among these photographs, I recognized myself in at least 3 different images from previous hiking trips I had taken over the past 2 years. The pictures showed me setting up camp, filtering water from streams, and walking along sections of trail that I remembered visiting during earlier adventures. Someone had been following me, watching me, and photographing me during multiple trips without my knowledge. The realization sent a wave of terror through my body that was unlike anything I had ever experienced in the wilderness. I also found a journal inside the shelter, written in the same strange symbols that I had seen carved into the trees. The pages were filled with detailed notes and sketches, including what appeared to be maps of the local trail system, and detailed observations about the habits and routines of various hikers who frequented the area. While I could not read the strange writing, the sketches and diagrams made it clear that whoever was using this shelter had been conducting some kind of systematic surveillance operation, targeting solo hikers in this remote section of the forest. The most chilling discovery was a collection of personal items that clearly belonged to other hikers. There were pieces of gear, clothing, and equipment that bore the names and contact information of at least a dozen different people. Some of these items appeared to be relatively new, while others showed signs of having been exposed to the weather for extended periods. I recognized several brand names and gear configurations that were popular among serious backpackers, and I began to realize that these items might have belonged to hikers who had gone missing in this area over the past several years. I spent nearly 2 hours documenting everything I could find in the shelter, taking photographs and GPS coordinates while trying to preserve the scene as much as possible for law enforcement. But as I worked, I began to hear sounds that suggested someone was approaching through the forest. The footsteps were deliberate and careful, moving in a way that indicated the person was trying to remain undetected while getting closer to my location. I quickly gathered my gear and retreated from the shelter, making my way back toward the main trail as quietly as possible. For the rest of that day, I had the constant feeling that I was being watched and followed. Every snapping branch and rustling leaf made me jump, and I found myself looking over my shoulder every few minutes to check for signs of pursuit. I abandoned my original hiking plan and decided to make my way back toward the trailhead as quickly as possible, covering what should have been 2 days of hiking in a single afternoon of forced marching. As I hiked out of the wilderness, I encountered 2 other solo hikers who were heading deeper into the forest. I tried to warn them about what I had found, but they seemed to think I was overreacting to what might have been nothing more than an abandoned, homeless encampment. They thanked me for the information, but continued on their planned route despite my warnings. I gave them my contact information and asked them to check in with me when they completed their trip, but I never heard from either of them again. When I reached my car at the trailhead parking area, I noticed that the old Ford pickup truck was still there, but now it was covered with an official notice from the Park Service, indicating that it had been abandoned for more than 72 hours. I called the park rangers immediately and reported everything I had discovered during my trip, providing them with the GPS coordinates of the hidden shelter and the photographs I had taken of the surveillance images and personal items. The investigation that followed revealed disturbing connections to several missing persons cases spanning the past 5 years. The personal items I had found in the shelter were matched to at least 7 different hikers who had been reported missing in the Monongahela National Forest area. Some of these cases had been classified as probable accidents or voluntary disappearances, but the evidence from the shelter suggested that something much more sinister had been taking place in that remote section of the wilderness. The strange symbols carved into the trees and written in the journal were eventually identified by a linguistics expert as a modified version of an ancient runic alphabet, adapted for modern use by someone with extensive knowledge of both historical writing systems and contemporary wilderness survival techniques. The surveillance operation appeared to have been conducted over a period of several years, with the perpetrator or perpetrators systematically targeting solo hikers who fit specific demographic and behavioral patterns. Law enforcement agencies from 3 different states eventually became involved in the investigation, as the evidence suggested that the surveillance and collection operation had been connected to disappearances across a much wider geographic area than initially suspected. The FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit was brought in to create a profile of the person or persons responsible, and the case was linked to similar incidents reported in remote wilderness areas throughout the Appalachian mountain region. Despite the extensive investigation and the substantial evidence that was recovered from the hidden shelter, no arrests were ever made in connection with the case. The shelter was found to have been abandoned sometime between my discovery of it and the arrival of the first law enforcement teams, with most of the evidence having been removed or destroyed. The only traces that remained were some of the carved symbols on the trees and a few items of camping equipment that yielded no useful forensic evidence. The 2 hikers I had warned on my way out of the forest were reported missing 4 days after I encountered them. Their planned route would have taken them directly through the area where I had found the hidden shelter. An extensive search and rescue operation was conducted, but no trace of them or their equipment was ever found. The case remains open, but with no new leads or evidence, the investigation has essentially gone cold. I still have nightmares about those photographs pinned to the wall of the shelter, especially the ones showing me during previous hiking trips when I had felt completely safe and alone in the wilderness. The knowledge that someone had been watching me, documenting my movements, and potentially planning something terrible has fundamentally changed my relationship with the outdoors. The mountains that once felt like a sanctuary now seem filled with hidden dangers and unseen threats. The West Virginia State Police still maintain an active investigation into the case, and they have asked me to remain available for further questioning as new information becomes available. I've provided them with copies of all my photographs and GPS data, and I check in with the lead investigator every few months to see if there have been any developments. So far, there have been none, but I continue to hope that someday the people responsible for these disappearances will be caught and held accountable for their crimes. I no longer hike alone, and I have never returned to that section of the Monongahela National Forest. Sometimes I wonder if I should have stayed longer that day, if I should have waited to confront whoever was approaching the shelter instead of running away. But then I remember those surveillance photographs and the collection of personal items from missing hikers, and I realized that my decision to leave probably saved my life. The wilderness still calls to me, but now I answer that call with companions by my side and emergency communication devices that keep me connected to the outside world at all times. My name is Jaelyn Harper, and until 18 months ago, I thought I had my life figured out. I was 32 years old, working as a marketing coordinator for a tech company in Richmond, Virginia, living in a trendy apartment downtown, and dating a guy who checked all the right boxes on paper. Everything was proceeding according to the plan I had laid out for myself after college. But then my grandmother passed away in November of 2023, and everything changed in ways I could never have anticipated. Grandmother Clara had always been the eccentric member of our family. She lived alone in an old cabin tucked away in the Blue Ridge Mountains, about 2 hours west of Richmond, in a place so remote the GPS could not find it, and the Postal Service delivered mail to a box 3 miles down a gravel road. The family had been trying to convince her to move into assisted living for years, but she refused to leave what she called her sanctuary. When she died peacefully in her sleep at the age of 89, none of us were surprised to learn that she had left the cabin and its surrounding 40 acres to me in her will. My parents and siblings assumed I would sell the property immediately. The real estate market in Virginia was strong, and mountain retreats were popular with wealthy retirees from Washington, D.C. and Richmond. But something about the idea of strangers trampling through Grandmother Clara's beloved woods did not sit right with me. She had always told me that I was the only grandchild who truly understood the mountains, even though I had only visited her cabin a handful of times during my childhood. Against everyone's advice, I decided to take a leave of absence from my job and spend a few months at the cabin to sort through her belongings and decide what to do with the property. I arrived at the cabin on a cold February morning, driving my Honda Civic up a winding dirt road that seemed to climb forever through dense forest. The last mile of the approach was so steep and narrow that I had serious doubts about whether my car would make it. But eventually I emerged into a small clearing where the cabin sat like something from a fairy tale. It was larger than I remembered from childhood visits. A 2-story log structure with a wraparound porch and a stone chimney that was already sending smoke into the gray winter sky. Grandmother Clara had apparently left the heat on, which struck me as oddly thoughtful for someone who had been dead for 3 months. The interior of the cabin was exactly as I remembered it from my childhood visits, filled with handmade furniture, quilts, and the smell of wood smoke and lavender. Every room was immaculately clean, as if Grandmother Clara had been expecting company. I spent the first few days settling in and exploring the house, marveling at the collection of books on Appalachian folklore and local history that filled an entire wall of the living room. She had apparently been researching the history of the land for decades, with detailed notes about the families who had lived here before the property was assembled into its current configuration in the early 1900s. It was on my 4th night at the cabin that I first noticed the Watcher. I had been reading by the fireplace when something made me look up toward the large picture window that faced the forest on the south side of the house. There, just at the edge of the tree line, about 50 yards away, stood a figure. At first glance, it looked like a person, tall and thin, wearing dark clothing that made it difficult to make out any details in the dim light. But something about the way it stood was wrong. It was too still, too perfectly motionless, like a statue rather than a living person. I watched the figure for several minutes, waiting for it to move or give some indication of what it was doing there. When it remained completely stationary, I began to convince myself that it was probably just a dead tree or a rock formation that looked like a person in the poor light. I got up to turn on the porch light for a better view, but by the time I flipped the switch and looked back toward the tree line, the figure was gone. I searched the entire visible area with the beam of a flashlight, but found no trace of whatever I had seen. The next morning, I decided to investigate the spot where the figure had been standing. The ground was soft from recent rain, and I expected to find footprints or some other evidence of human presence. Instead, I found something that made my blood run cold. The earth beneath the trees was covered with what appeared to be animal tracks, but not from any animal I could identify. The prints were roughly the size and shape of human feet, but they showed claws instead of toes, and they pressed much deeper into the soil than footprints from a person of normal weight should have. The tracks formed a rough circle around a large oak tree, as if something had been walking around and around the trunk for an extended period. The bark of the tree showed fresh scratches at about shoulder height, deep gouges that looked like they had been made by claws or some other sharp implement. Most disturbing of all, attached to one of the lower branches was what appeared to be a small animal skull, bleached white and hanging from a piece of string like some kind of grotesque ornament. I took photographs of everything I found and brought them back to the cabin, where I spent the rest of the day researching similar incidents online. What I discovered in various folklore databases and paranormal investigation websites was deeply unsettling. The Blue Ridge Mountains, particularly this specific area of Virginia, had a long history of encounters with what locals called the Watcher. According to multiple accounts dating back to the early 1800s, the entity was described as a tall, humanoid figure that would observe people from the forest, always maintaining a distance but never actually approaching or making direct contact. The historical accounts I found described the same behavior I had witnessed. The figure would appear at the edge of clearings or near houses, remain perfectly still for extended periods, then vanish without a trace when anyone tried to approach or get a better look. Several accounts mentioned the strange footprints in the scratched trees, along with the disturbing practice of hanging small animal bones from branches as if marking territory or sending some kind of message. What made these historical accounts particularly chilling was the pattern of escalation they described. In every case, the Watcher would begin by observing from a distance, but over time it would move closer and closer to its target. Eventually, according to the stories, people would begin finding evidence that the entity had been on their property during the night, sometimes even inside their homes. The final stage, which several accounts described in terrifying detail, involved direct confrontation with the entity, usually resulting in the observer fleeing the area permanently, or, in a few cases, disappearing entirely. Over the following weeks, my encounters with the Watcher became more frequent and more disturbing. Every night, without fail, the figure would appear somewhere along the tree line around the cabin. Sometimes, it would be in the same spot I had first seen it, but often it would appear in different locations, as if it was slowly circling the property and observing from multiple angles. I began keeping a journal of the sightings, noting the time, location, and duration of each encounter. The pattern that emerged was deeply unsettling. Each night, the figure appeared to be standing slightly closer to the cabin than it had the night before. The distance was measured in feet rather than yards, so the progression was gradual enough that I might not have noticed it without careful documentation. But the journal made it clear that whatever was watching me was systematically reducing the space between us, moving closer with each passing day. During the daylight hours, I would venture out to investigate the spots where the figure had been standing. Each location showed the same evidence, the circular pattern of strange footprints, scratches on nearby trees, and small animal bones hanging from branches. But I began to notice additional details that had not been present during my first investigation. The scratches on the trees were getting deeper and more extensive, as if the entity was becoming more agitated or excited. The animal bones were increasing in number, creating grotesque displays that seemed deliberately arranged to be visible from the cabin. Most disturbing of all, I began finding evidence that the Watcher had been moving around the property during the night when I could not see it. Footprints appeared in the soft earth around the cabin's foundation, leading from the forest to the walls of the house and then back again. The prints would circle the entire structure, sometimes multiple times in a single night, as if the entity was studying the building and looking for potential entry points. I installed motion-activated security cameras around the property, hoping to capture clear footage of whatever was stalking me. The cameras detected movement almost every night, but the footage they recorded was frustratingly unclear. The figure appeared as little more than a dark shadow moving between trees, always staying just far enough away that no details were visible. The cameras seemed to malfunction whenever the entity was closest to the house, producing distorted images filled with static and interference that made analysis impossible. On one particularly clear night in early April, I decided to try a more direct approach. I waited by the window until the figure appeared in its usual spot at the tree line, then grabbed a powerful flashlight and headed outside to confront it directly. I made it about halfway across the clearing before I realized that approaching the entity was a terrible mistake. As I got closer, details became visible that had not been apparent from inside the cabin. The figure was definitely not human, despite its roughly humanoid shape. It was at least 7 feet tall, with limbs that were too long and joints that bent in ways that human anatomy did not allow. What I had initially taken for dark clothing was actually the entity's skin, which had a texture like tree bark, but seemed to shift and writhe as if it was not entirely solid. The most terrifying detail was its face, or what should have been its face. Instead of human features, there was a smooth, featureless surface that somehow conveyed intense malevolence and hunger. I could feel its attention focused on me like a physical weight, and every instinct I possessed screamed at me to run. I backed away, slowly, trying not to make any sudden movements that might provoke the entity into action. But as I retreated, it began to move toward me for the first time since I'd been at the cabin. Its gait was unnatural and wrong, a fluid gliding motion that covered ground much faster than walking should allow. I abandoned any pretense of calm and ran for the cabin as fast as I could, slamming the door behind me and turning every lock I could find. The entity followed me to the edge of the clearing but stopped at the tree line, resuming its usual motionless vigil. However, something fundamental had changed in our relationship. Where before it had been content to observe from a distance, now it seemed to be actively studying me, looking for weaknesses or opportunities. The scratches on trees around the property became more aggressive, deep gouges that went completely through the bark and into the heartwood. The animal bones hanging from branches multiplied until some trees looked like grotesque Christmas trees decorated with death. Most terrifying of all, I began to find evidence that the entity was testing the boundaries of the cabin itself. Scratches appeared on the walls of the house, starting at ground level and reaching up to the second-story windows. The scratches were shallow at first, but they grew deeper each night, as if the entity was gradually learning how to damage the structure that protected me. I reinforced the doors and windows with additional locks and security devices, but I knew that physical barriers would not be enough to keep out something that seemed to exist partially outside the normal rules of reality. The breaking point came on a night in late April when I was awakened by sounds from inside the cabin. Footsteps were moving through the rooms downstairs, slow and deliberate, as if someone was exploring the layout of the house. I grabbed the baseball bat I had started keeping beside my bed and crept to the top of the stairs, listening to the sounds of my uninvited visitor moving through the kitchen and living room below. The footsteps were wrong, making soft scraping sounds against the wooden floors rather than the normal impact of shoes or bare feet. I waited at the top of the stairs for what felt like hours, listening to the entity move through my grandmother's house, and occasionally hearing sounds that suggested it was examining objects or furniture. Eventually, the sound stopped, and I heard the front door open and close with a soft click. When I finally worked up the courage to investigate, I found that nothing had been damaged or moved, but the entire house smelled of damp earth and decay, as if something from deep in the forest had left its scent behind as a calling card. That was the night I decided to leave the cabin permanently. I packed my essential belongings in less than an hour and was on the road back to Richmond before dawn, driving my Honda Civic down that terrifying mountain road one last time. I left most of my grandmother's possessions behind, along with all the research I had done about the Watcher and the history of the property. Some things are better left undisturbed, and some places are meant to remain empty. I put the cabin and its 40 acres on the market as soon as I returned to Richmond, accepting the first reasonable offer I received from a real estate developer who planned to subdivide the land for vacation homes. I never told the buyers about the Watcher or the strange events I had experienced during my time at the property. Sometimes I wonder if I should have warned them, but I suspect they would not have believed me anyway. People who live in cities have a hard time accepting that there are things in the deep woods that cannot be explained or reasoned with. The cabin sold in June of 2024, and according to the real estate agent, the new owners plan to tear down the old structure and build a modern vacation retreat. I have not heard anything about the property since the sale closed, and I have made a deliberate effort not to research what happened to the land or the people who bought it. Some knowledge comes with a price that is too high to pay, and some mysteries are better left unsolved. I returned to my job in Richmond and eventually resumed something resembling a normal life, but I've never forgotten the feeling of being watched by something that should not exist. Sometimes, when I'm walking alone at night or sitting by a window after dark, I catch myself scanning the shadows for signs of a tall, motionless figure. The rational part of my mind knows that the Watcher was tied to that specific place in the mountains, but the deeper, more primitive part of my brain remains convinced that some things can follow you home if you give them enough reason to be interested. I no longer live in ground floor apartments, and I always keep my curtains closed after sunset. My name is Janae Caldwell, and for 26 years, I thought I knew everything there was to know about my hometown of Hollow Creek, Kentucky. I was born there in 1997, graduated from the local high school, and never planned to leave the small mining community tucked deep into the mountains of eastern Kentucky. Most of the coal operations had shut down by the time I was old enough to understand what they were, but the abandoned mine shafts and processing facilities still dotted the landscape like scars from a more prosperous past. I worked as a clerk at the county courthouse in the neighboring town of Pine Ridge, commuting 20 minutes each way through winding mountain roads that most GPS systems could not navigate properly. Hollow Creek had always been the kind of place where everybody knew everybody else's business, or at least thought they did. We had maybe 400 residents at our peak, most of them families that had been there for generations, working the mines until they played out in the early 1990s. After that, people started leaving for jobs in Lexington or Louisville, and by the time I was in high school, we were down to maybe 200 permanent residents, mostly older folks who owned their homes outright and had nowhere else to go. The community was built in a narrow valley between two ridge lines, with Hollow Creek itself running right down the middle of town. The old mine entrances were scattered throughout the surrounding hills, most of them sealed with concrete barriers or warning signs that had been weathered by decades of mountain winters. As kids, we were always told to stay away from the mine sites because of the dangers of cave-ins, toxic gases, and unstable ground. But like most local children, we ignored those warnings whenever we thought we could get away with it. It was during one of these unauthorized explorations in September of 2023 that I stumbled across something that would change my understanding of Hollow Creek forever. I was hiking with my boyfriend Marcus through an area called Devil's Backbone, a ridge that overlooked the town and contained the entrances to 3 different mine shafts from the old consolidated coal operation. We were looking for a good spot to watch the sunset when Marcus noticed that one of the mine entrances that should have been sealed was standing wide open. The concrete barrier that had blocked the entrance for as long as either of us could remember was lying in pieces on the ground, as if it had been deliberately destroyed from the inside. The opening was large enough for a person to walk through upright, and cool air was flowing out of the tunnel, carrying a smell that was wrong in a way I could not immediately identify. It was not the musty odor of old mine workings that we were familiar with, but something organic and unpleasant that made both of us take an instinctive step backward. Marcus wanted to leave immediately, but curiosity got the better of me. I pulled out my phone and turned on the flashlight, peering into the tunnel beyond the broken barrier. The mine shaft extended straight back into the mountain for about 30 feet before making a sharp turn to the right. The walls were covered with graffiti that looked much more recent than the mine closure, and there were clear signs that people had been using the space regularly. Empty beer cans, fast food containers, and cigarette butts littered the floor of the tunnel. But it was what I saw hanging from the ceiling support beams that made me grab Marcus by the arm and pull him away from the entrance. Suspended from the wooden timbers were what appeared to be animal bones, arranged in patterns that seemed deliberate rather than random. The bones were bleached white and had obviously been there for a considerable length of time, but they were not from any animals I recognized from the local wildlife. Some of them were far too large to have come from deer or wild boar, while others were shaped in ways that did not match anything I had learned about animal anatomy. We left the area immediately and did not discuss what we had seen until we got back to town that evening. Over dinner at the local diner, I tried to convince Marcus that we should report our discovery to the sheriff's department, but he argued that we would only get in trouble for trespassing on property that was clearly posted with no entry signs. He pointed out that teenagers had been using the old mine sites for parties and recreation for decades, and the bone display was probably just someone's idea of Halloween decorations left over from previous years. I might have been convinced by his reasoning if not for a conversation I overheard the next day at the courthouse where I worked. 2 deputies were discussing a missing persons case from 2019 involving a young woman named Sarah Beth Combs, who had disappeared while hiking in the area around Devil's Backbone. According to their conversation, Sarah Beth's car had been found at a trailhead parking area, but despite extensive searches, no trace of her or her hiking equipment had ever been discovered. The case had eventually gone cold when investigators ran out of leads to follow. That night, I did something I had never done before in my 26 years of living in Hollow Creek. I went to the public library and started researching missing persons cases from our area using the newspaper archives and online databases. What I discovered kept me awake until 3 in the morning and fundamentally changed my understanding of the place where I had grown up. Over the past 15 years, at least 12 people had gone missing in the mountains surrounding Hollow Creek, under circumstances that could not be easily explained. The cases followed a disturbing pattern. All of the missing persons were young adults between the ages of 18 and 35. All were described as experienced hikers or outdoors enthusiasts, and all had disappeared while exploring areas near the old mine sites. The disappearances were spread out over more than a decade, with gaps of several months or even years between incidents, which had prevented law enforcement from recognizing any connection between the cases. Most troubling of all, I discovered that several of the missing persons had been seen or spoken to by local residents in the days before they vanished, and many had mentioned their intention to explore the abandoned mine workings despite the posted warnings and safety barriers. It appeared that someone or something was using the mines as hunting grounds, targeting visitors who ventured into areas where they could disappear without witnesses. I spent the following weekend conducting my own investigation, visiting the families of some of the missing persons and asking questions that the authorities had apparently never thought to ask. What I learned was that several of the victims had mentioned meeting a local resident who had offered to show them safe ways to access the old mine sites. The descriptions of this person were vague and sometimes contradictory, but several witnesses mentioned a man in his 40s or 50s who claimed to be a former mine worker with detailed knowledge of the underground tunnel systems. More disturbingly, I discovered that some of the missing persons had been carrying significant amounts of cash or valuable equipment when they disappeared. Sarah Beth Combs had been wearing jewelry worth several $1,000s and carrying photography equipment that would have been attractive to thieves. A missing hiker from 2021 named David Park had withdrawn $800 in cash the day before his disappearance, apparently planning to purchase camping gear from someone he had met online. The pattern that emerged suggested that the disappearances were not random accidents or the work of wild animals, but a deliberate predatory operation targeting vulnerable visitors with valuable possessions. Someone was using their knowledge of the local terrain and the abandoned mine infrastructure to lure victims into situations where they could be robbed and eliminated without detection. I took my findings to the sheriff's department, expecting them to launch an immediate investigation based on the connections I had uncovered. Instead, I was met with skepticism and dismissal from deputies who seemed more interested in protecting the county's reputation than solving crimes. They pointed out that most of the missing persons were from outside the area and suggested that urban hikers often overestimated their abilities in challenging mountain terrain. According to their theory, the disappearances were tragic accidents that could be explained by falls, exposure, or animal attacks. Frustrated by the official response, I decided to continue my investigation independently. I returned to the Devil's Backbone mine entrance with better equipment, including a powerful flashlight, recording device, and GPS unit. This time, I was determined to document whatever was hidden in the tunnel system beyond the broken concrete barrier. I also brought a canister of pepper spray and made sure that multiple people knew where I was going and when I planned to return. The mine tunnel extended much further into the mountain than I had realized during my first visit. Beyond the initial turn to the right, the passage continued for several hundred yards before branching into multiple smaller tunnels that disappeared into darkness. The bone displays I had noticed earlier were just the beginning of a much more extensive and disturbing collection. Human personal items were arranged throughout the tunnel system like trophies, including clothing, jewelry, identification documents, and electronic devices that clearly belonged to the missing hikers. In one of the side tunnels, I found what appeared to be a makeshift living space, complete with sleeping bags, camping stoves, and storage containers filled with non-perishable food. The area showed signs of regular habitation, but whoever was using it had obviously been away for some time based on the dust accumulation and the condition of the perishable items. Scattered throughout the living area were notebooks filled with detailed observations about hiking patterns, visitor schedules, and the personal habits of people who frequented the trail system around Hollow Creek. The most chilling discovery was a collection of photographs showing various hikers and campers in the area, apparently taken without their knowledge from concealed positions. Many of the people in these surveillance photos matched descriptions of the missing persons I had researched. The photographs were organized chronologically and annotated with notes about the subject's equipment, apparent financial status, and vulnerability to approach by a helpful local resident. I also found detailed maps of the mine tunnel system, showing connections between different entrances and exits that would allow someone to move through the underground passages without being detected on the surface. Some of the mapped tunnels connected to mine shafts that were miles apart, creating an extensive network of hidden travel routes throughout the mountains around Hollow Creek. The maps indicated that whoever was using this underground base had an intimate knowledge of the local mining history and infrastructure. As I was documenting the evidence with my camera and GPS unit, I heard sounds that indicated someone was approaching through one of the tunnel entrances. The footsteps were careful and deliberate, suggesting that the person was familiar with the underground environment and knew how to move quietly through the passages. I quickly gathered my equipment and retreated deeper into the mine system, using the detailed maps I had found to navigate toward an alternate exit that would bring me out on the opposite side of Devil's Backbone. I managed to escape from the mine tunnels without encountering whoever had been approaching, but the experience convinced me that I was dealing with someone who was actively using the underground network and might return at any time. I immediately drove to the state police barracks in the county seat and demanded to speak with investigators who had the authority to pursue cases across multiple jurisdictions. This time, the evidence I had collected was too substantial to ignore or dismiss. The investigation that followed involved multiple law enforcement agencies and forensic specialists who spent weeks examining the mine tunnel system and processing the evidence I had discovered. The personal items and surveillance photographs were matched to 9 of the 12 missing persons cases I had identified, confirming that the disappearances were connected and intentional rather than accidental. The FBI's Serial Crimes Unit was brought in to coordinate the investigation and develop profiles of the person or persons responsible. The search for the perpetrator led to the arrest of Herman Willis, a 53-year-old former mine worker who had been living in a remote cabin about 5 miles from Hollow Creek. Willis had an extensive knowledge of the local mine system from his years working for Consolidated Coal, and he had been using that knowledge to lure hikers into situations where he could rob and kill them without detection. The victims' bodies were eventually found in sealed sections of the mine tunnels that Willis had been using as disposal sites for more than a decade. Willis was convicted on 9 counts of first-degree murder and received multiple life sentences without the possibility of parole. The investigation also revealed connections to similar cases in other mining regions of Kentucky and West Virginia, suggesting that his criminal activities had been much more extensive than initially suspected. Some of those cases remain under investigation by federal authorities. The town of Hollow Creek has never fully recovered from the revelation that one of its longtime residents was responsible for such extensive violence against visitors to our community. The publicity from the case destroyed our reputation as a safe destination for outdoor recreation, and several local businesses that depended on hiking and camping tourism have been forced to close. Many residents have moved away, and the population has dropped below 150 people for the first time since the community was established. I still live in Hollow Creek, but I no longer take the safety and familiarity of my hometown for granted. The knowledge that someone was able to operate as a predator in our community for so many years without detection has changed my perception of how well any of us really knows our neighbors. The mountains, that once felt like a protective barrier around our small community now seem filled with hidden dangers and unknown threats that could emerge at any time. My name is Jaelyn Patterson, and I have been a park ranger at Daniel Boone National Forest in southeastern Kentucky for 8 years. I grew up in these mountains, hiking the trails with my grandfather, who taught me to read the forest like a book. Every broken branch, every disturbed patch of earth, every change in animal behavior told a story about what had passed through the wilderness. I thought I understood these woods better than anyone, until I encountered something that challenged everything I believed about the natural world. The incident occurred during my second week working the Sheltowee Trace section, a 130-mile trail that winds through some of the most remote areas of the national forest. I was conducting routine maintenance checks on the trail markers and campsites, a job that typically took me 3 days to complete working alone. October of 2022 had been unusually warm, with daytime temperatures still reaching the 70s and nights staying in the 50s. The extended growing season had kept the forest unusually active, with wildlife movement patterns that seemed different from previous years. On the morning of October 13th, I started my patrol at the Red River Gorge area, planning to work my way south toward the Cumberland Falls region over the next 72 hours. The first day passed without incident, and I made camp at a designated backcountry site near Natural Bridge around 6 that evening. I had been to this particular campsite dozens of times over the years, and it always felt like one of the safer and more peaceful locations in the forest. The site was surrounded by towering sandstone cliffs that provided natural windbreaks and shelter, with a reliable water source and excellent sight lines in all directions. It was around midnight when I first heard the voices. I had been asleep in my tent for about 2 hours when something woke me with the unmistakable feeling that I was no longer alone in the area. At first, I heard what sounded like normal conversation coming from somewhere beyond the tree line, too distant and muffled for me to make out specific words. My immediate assumption was that other campers had arrived at the site after dark, which was unusual but not unheard of among experienced backpackers. I lay in my sleeping bag listening to the voices for several minutes, trying to determine how many people were involved and whether they needed any assistance. But as I became more alert, I realized that something about the conversation was wrong. The voices seemed to be coming from different locations around the campsite, as if multiple people were positioned in a wide circle rather than gathered together in one spot. More disturbing, the tone and rhythm of the speech was off in a way that made my skin crawl. The voices rose and fell in patterns that did not match normal human conversation, with pauses and inflections that seemed deliberately unnatural. I got dressed and grabbed my flashlight, planning to identify myself as a park ranger and make contact with the other campers. But as I unzipped my tent and stepped outside, the voices stopped immediately, as if whoever was out there had been watching for my appearance. The silence that followed was absolute, not even the normal nighttime sounds of insects and small animals. I called out in my official capacity, announcing that I was a park ranger and asking if anyone needed assistance. There was no response, but I had the distinct feeling that I was being observed from multiple locations in the darkness beyond my flashlight beam. I spent the next hour conducting a thorough search of the area around the campsite, checking for signs of other people or explanations for the voices I had heard. I found no evidence of human presence, no footprints, no disturbed vegetation, no camping equipment, and no tire tracks or other indications that anyone had approached the site. The absence of any physical evidence was as disturbing as the voices themselves had been. People do not move through wilderness areas without leaving traces, especially in the soft forest floor around Natural Bridge. The second night, I made camp at a different site about 12 miles south of my first location. This area was even more remote, accessible only by foot trail and used by perhaps a dozen visitors per year. I chose the location specifically because it offered excellent visibility and multiple escape routes if I encountered anything threatening. I also set up motion-activated cameras at strategic points around the perimeter, hoping to capture evidence of whatever had been watching me the previous night. Around 2 in the morning, the voices returned. This time, however, they were much closer to my position and clearly audible despite coming from different directions around my campsite. What I heard made my blood run cold. The voices were calling my name, but not in the way that humans would call to someone. Each voice seemed to be testing different pronunciations and inflections, as if something was trying to learn how to say Jaelyn correctly. Some attempts were recognizable while others were distorted beyond understanding, but all of them had the same unnatural quality that suggested they were not coming from human throats. The most terrifying aspect was that the voices seemed to be getting closer with each repetition of my name. What started as distant calls gradually moved inward toward my position, maintaining the circular pattern, but tightening the radius with each iteration. I realized that whatever was out there was using my name to try to lure me away from the safety of my campsite and into the forest where I would be more vulnerable. I remained in my tent with my radio and emergency beacon ready, documenting everything I could hear on my voice recorder. The voices continued for nearly 3 hours, sometimes calling my name and sometimes engaging in that strange, stilted conversation I had heard the night before. Occasionally, I would hear what sounded like perfect imitations of human speech, but when I listened carefully, I realized that the words were being repeated in patterns that made no sense, as if something was playing back fragments of conversations it had overheard without understanding their meaning. Around 5 in the morning, the voices finally stopped, and normal forest sounds gradually returned. When dawn broke, I investigated the area around my campsite and found evidence that was both fascinating and terrifying. The motion-activated cameras had been triggered multiple times during the night, but the footage they captured showed nothing but empty forest. However, the audio tracks from the cameras confirmed that the voices had been real and had indeed been coming from the locations where the cameras were positioned. More disturbing, I found footprints in the soft earth around each camera location. The prints were roughly human in size and shape, but they showed no evidence of boots or shoes. The impressions were deep and widely spaced, suggesting that whatever made them was both heavy and capable of covering ground with long strides. Most unsettling of all, the footprints approached each camera from the forest, circled the device several times, then returned to the tree line along the same path. I consulted the historical records maintained at the ranger station and discovered that similar incidents had been reported in this area for more than 50 years. Rangers, hikers, and campers had all described encounters with voices that called their names or imitated human speech in unnatural ways. Several reports mentioned the circular movement pattern and the gradual approach toward campsites or trail locations. In every case, the voices seemed to know the names of the people they were targeting, even when those individuals were alone and had not introduced themselves to anyone in the area. The most chilling discovery was a series of reports from the 1970s describing incidents where people had actually responded to the voices calling their names. In 3 documented cases, individuals had left their campsites to investigate the source of the calls and had become lost in the forest for days or weeks. When they were finally found by search and rescue teams, they described following voices that led them deeper and deeper into unmarked wilderness areas, always promising that the source of the sound was just a little bit further ahead. 2 of these individuals were found in a state of severe dehydration and malnutrition, unable to provide coherent accounts of where they had been or how they had survived. The 3rd person was never found despite extensive searches, and his case remains listed as an unsolved missing person incident. All 3 cases occurred in the same general area where I had encountered the voices, and all involved the same pattern of names being called in unnatural ways. I also found references to Cherokee folklore about entities that live in the deep forest and use human voices to lure people away from safety. According to these traditional stories, the creatures are not malevolent in the way that humans understand evil, but they exist according to different rules and have needs that can be dangerous to people who encounter them. The Cherokee names for these entities translate roughly to the mimics, or those who repeat, and the traditional advice is to never respond to voices calling your name when you are alone in the wilderness. My research revealed that Daniel Boone National Forest encompasses areas that were considered sacred or forbidden by Cherokee communities for generations before European settlement. Some locations were specifically avoided because of encounters with entities that could not be explained or reasoned with. The modern trail system unfortunately runs through several of these traditionally avoided areas, potentially exposing visitors to dangers that indigenous communities had learned to respect and navigate around. On my third night, I made the decision to try a different approach to the phenomenon. Instead of hiding in my tent when the voices appeared, I remained outside with my recording equipment and tried to document as much as possible about their behavior and characteristics. I also brought along a Cherokee language guide that I had found in the ranger station library, hoping to understand any patterns or meanings in the vocalizations. The voices appeared again around midnight, but this time they seemed more aggressive and insistent. Instead of the gradual approach pattern I had observed on previous nights, they immediately surrounded my position at close range. The calls were louder and more frequent, with my name being repeated in overlapping patterns that created an almost hypnotic effect. I found myself taking steps away from my campsite before I realized what was happening and forced myself to return to my original position. What disturbed me most was that the voices began incorporating other information that they should not have known. They called out my full name, my badge number, and even the names of family members and friends who had nothing to do with my work in the forest. They seemed to have access to personal information that was not available through any normal means, as if they were reading my thoughts or drawing details from my memory. The encounter escalated when I began to hear my own voice calling back to me from the forest. The entity was now imitating not just my name, but my entire vocal pattern, creating conversations where I seemed to be talking to myself from multiple locations around the campsite. The effect was deeply disorienting, and I began to understand how previous victims had become confused and lost in the wilderness. I ended my patrol early the next morning and returned to headquarters to file a comprehensive report about the incidents. My supervisor was skeptical about the more unusual aspects of my account, but the audio recordings I had captured provided compelling evidence that something extraordinary was happening in that section of the forest. The decision was made to temporarily restrict camping in the area while further investigation could be conducted. A team of wildlife biologists and acoustic specialists spent 2 weeks in the region attempting to document and explain the phenomena I had reported. They captured similar audio recordings and confirmed that the vocalizations were unlike anything produced by known animals in the region. However, they were unable to establish visual contact with whatever was creating the sounds, and their presence seemed to reduce the frequency and intensity of the encounters. Based on my experiences and the historical pattern of incidents, Daniel Boone National Forest now includes warnings in official trail guides about the importance of not responding to voices calling your name when camping alone in remote areas. Rangers are trained to be aware of the phenomena and to report any encounters through official channels. We also work with Cherokee cultural advisors to better understand the traditional knowledge about these entities and how to minimize dangerous encounters. I continue to work as a park ranger in Daniel Boone National Forest, but I no longer patrol the remote sections alone. The voices have not followed me to other areas, confirming my belief that they are tied to specific locations rather than individuals. However, The experience has fundamentally changed my understanding of the wilderness and the things that share these mountains with us. Some places in the forest are meant to be approached with respect and caution, and some voices should never be answered, no matter how familiar they sound. My name is Indiana Mills, and I have spent the last 6 years documenting abandoned structures throughout the Great Smoky Mountains region of Tennessee. As an urban explorer and photographer, I specialize in capturing the forgotten history of Appalachian communities, from old mining operations to ghost towns that were left behind when the coal industry collapsed. I thought I had seen everything these mountains had to offer in terms of human abandonment and decay, until I discovered what was hidden in an old moonshine operation deep in the Cherokee National Forest. The location came to my attention through a tip from a local historian named Earl Whitman, who had been researching the Prohibition-era history of the region for a book he was writing about illegal whiskey production in East Tennessee. Earl had found references in old court records to a large-scale distillery operation that had been raided by federal agents in 1934, but the exact location of the site had never been documented in any official records. He knew about my work photographing abandoned sites and asked if I would be interested in trying to locate the lost distillery. According to the historical documents Earl had uncovered, the operation had been run by a family named the Craigheads, who had supposedly been producing high-quality moonshine for distribution throughout the southeastern United States. The federal raid that shut them down had been front-page news in the Knoxville papers, but the remote location of the distillery had made it difficult for authorities to completely dismantle the operation. Earl believed that substantial physical evidence of the site might still exist, hidden somewhere in the vast wilderness areas that now make up the National Forest. I spent 3 weekends in October of 2023 searching for the lost distillery, using topographical maps from the 1930s and aerial photographs that showed clearings and structures that no longer appeared on modern surveys. The search area covered approximately 40 square miles of extremely rugged terrain, accessible only on foot through unmarked trails and creek beds that required technical climbing skills to navigate safely. On my 4th expedition, I was following an old logging road that had been abandoned for decades when I noticed a gap in the forest canopy that suggested a man-made clearing ahead. The trees in this area were noticeably younger than the old-growth forest surrounding it, indicating that the land had been cleared and then allowed to return to its natural state over the past several decades. As I pushed through the underbrush toward the clearing, I began to see evidence of stone foundations and metal debris scattered throughout the area. The site was larger and more complex than I had expected to find. The main distillery building had been constructed of native stone and was still largely intact, though the roof had collapsed long ago and vegetation was growing up through the floor. Multiple outbuildings surrounded the main structure, including what appeared to be storage facilities, living quarters, and workshops for maintaining the equipment. The entire complex covered about 3 acres and had obviously been designed to support a major commercial operation, rather than the small family stills that were more common in the region. What immediately struck me as unusual was the condition of the site. While the buildings showed the expected signs of decades of abandonment, much of the equipment appeared to have been maintained or even replaced with modern components. Copper tubing, fermentation vessels, and distillation apparatus throughout the complex showed no signs of the corrosion and decay that should have been evident after 90 years of exposure to mountain weather. Some pieces of equipment were clearly contemporary, with manufacturing dates from the 1990s and 2000s. As I explored the main distillery building, I found evidence that the facility had been actively used much more recently than the 1930s. Fresh tire tracks led to a loading area behind the main building, and there were clear signs that heavy machinery had been operated in the area within the past few months. Empty fuel containers, modern hand tools, and electrical cables suggested that someone had been maintaining and possibly expanding the original moonshine operation. More disturbing were the modifications that had been made to the original structures. The stone walls of several buildings had been reinforced with concrete and steel, creating spaces that looked more like bunkers or secure storage facilities than traditional distillery buildings. Heavy steel doors with multiple locking mechanisms had been installed on some of the structures, and small windows had been covered with metal grates that could only be opened from the inside. The overall effect was of a compound designed to keep people out rather than simply protect equipment from the weather. I also found evidence of recent habitation at the site. One of the outbuildings had been converted into living quarters with modern amenities, including a generator, propane heating system, and communication equipment. Personal belongings, clothing, and food supplies suggested that someone had been living at the location on a regular basis, possibly for extended periods. The living space was clean and organized, indicating ongoing occupation rather than temporary camping. The most unsettling discovery was a series of underground chambers that had been excavated beneath the main distillery building. These spaces were accessible through a concealed entrance behind one of the large fermentation tanks, and they extended much deeper into the mountainside than would have been necessary for any legitimate distillation operation. The chambers were lined with concrete and equipped with ventilation systems, electrical lighting, and what appeared to be climate control equipment. Inside these underground spaces, I found items that had nothing to do with alcohol production. Large quantities of military surplus equipment, weapons, ammunition, and survival supplies were stored in organized inventories that suggested long-term preparation for some kind of extended isolation. Communication equipment, maps, and documents scattered throughout the area indicated that the site was being used as some kind of base of operations for activities that extended far beyond moonshine production. Most disturbing of all were the symbols that had been painted on the walls throughout the underground complex. These were not random graffiti or decorative elements, but carefully executed designs that appeared to have specific meanings and purposes. Many of the symbols resembled those used in various extremist ideologies, while others seemed to be derived from occult or religious traditions that I could not immediately identify. The symbols were painted in red and black and appeared to have been refreshed periodically, indicating ongoing use and maintenance. I also found evidence of recent meetings or gatherings at the site. One of the larger chambers contained seating arrangements for approximately 20 people, along with presentation equipment and materials that suggested regular group meetings or training sessions. Documents and printed materials scattered throughout this area contained content related to anti-government sentiment, survivalist philosophies, and what appeared to be planning for some kind of armed resistance or insurgency activity. As I was documenting these discoveries with my camera, I heard the sound of vehicles approaching the site from the access road I had used to reach the location. The engines sounded like trucks or SUVs, and there were clearly multiple vehicles involved. I quickly gathered my equipment and retreated to a concealed position in the forest beyond the compound, where I could observe without being detected by whoever was arriving. 3 pickup trucks and a large SUV pulled into the clearing and parked near the main distillery building. 8 men got out of the vehicles, all wearing camouflage clothing and carrying weapons. Their behavior and equipment suggested military or law enforcement training, and they moved through the site with the familiarity of people who had been there many times before. They immediately began unloading supplies from the vehicles and carrying them into the underground chambers I had just finished exploring. I remained hidden for almost 2 hours, watching the men work and trying to understand the nature of their activities. They appeared to be conducting some kind of inventory or inspection of the stored materials, and several of them spent time examining maps and documents in what I had identified as the meeting room. Their conversations were too distant for me to make out specific words, but their body language and interactions suggested that this was a serious, organized operation rather than casual recreational activity. When the men finished their work and prepared to leave the site, I waited an additional hour before emerging from my hiding position. I quickly gathered my camera equipment and notes, then left the area as quickly as possible, using a different route than the access road the trucks had used. I was concerned that the men might return unexpectedly, or that they had left someone behind to monitor the site. I reported my discoveries to the Tennessee Bureau of Investigation and the FBI, providing detailed photographs, GPS coordinates, and descriptions of everything I had observed at the site. The federal agents who interviewed me were particularly interested in the weapons and communications equipment I had documented, as well as the extremist materials and symbols I had found throughout the complex. The investigation that followed involved multiple law enforcement agencies and took several months to complete. The site was eventually raided by federal agents who arrested 6 individuals and seized large quantities of illegal weapons, explosives, and other materials related to domestic terrorism planning. The investigation revealed connections to extremist groups operating throughout the southeastern United States, with the former Moonshine operation serving as a central coordination point for their activities. The men I had observed at the site were members of a militia organization that had been using the remote location for weapon storage, training exercises, and planning sessions for potential attacks on government facilities. They had chosen the site specifically because of its isolation and its history as a place where illegal activities had been successfully concealed from authorities for extended periods. The original Moonshine operation had provided both physical infrastructure and cultural camouflage for their modern criminal activities. Several of the individuals arrested in connection with the case were charged with federal terrorism offenses and conspiracy charges related to planned attacks on government buildings and law enforcement facilities. The investigation also uncovered evidence of connections to other extremist incidents throughout the region, including weapons trafficking and recruitment activities targeting military veterans and disaffected rural communities. The Cherokee National Forest has since increased security and monitoring in the area where the compound was located, and several other remote sites with similar potential for misuse have been identified and placed under surveillance. Law enforcement agencies now coordinate more closely to track suspicious activities in wilderness, areas that might be used to conceal illegal operations similar to what I discovered at the old Craghead Distillery site. I have continued my work documenting abandoned structures throughout the Appalachian region, but I now coordinate with law enforcement agencies before, exploring sites that might have security implications. The experience taught me that some abandoned places are not as empty as they appear, and that the isolation that makes mountain locations attractive for historical preservation can also make them appealing to people with more dangerous intentions. The mountains that once hid moonshine, operations from federal agents during Prohibition, continue to provide concealment for those who operate outside the law. My name is Jaelyn Bell, and I am the 6th-generation descendant of John Bell, the Tennessee farmer whose family was tormented by the entity that became known as the Bell Witch in the early 1800s. For most of my life, I considered the family stories about our supernatural heritage to be nothing more than local folklore that had been exaggerated and romanticized over the centuries. I grew up in Robertson County, Tennessee, not far from where the original incidents occurred, and I had always been proud of our connection to one of America's most famous ghost stories, even if I did not believe the events had actually happened as described. That changed completely in the summer of 2023, when I inherited my great-uncle's property on Bell Road, less than 3 miles from the original Bell homestead. The house itself was built in 1958, long after the supposed hauntings of the early 1800s, but it sat on land that had been in the Bell family continuously since my ancestor first settled in the area. Great-uncle Marcus had lived alone on the property for 40 years, and family members had always considered him to be somewhat eccentric, but no one had ever suggested that he experienced anything supernatural during his time there. I moved into the house in July of 2023, planning to renovate the property and eventually sell it to help pay for my daughter's college education. The house was structurally sound, but had not been updated since the 1970s, so I was looking at several months of work to bring it up to modern standards. My wife Sarah and our 15-year-old daughter Emma stayed at our primary residence in Nashville while I commuted back and forth to work on the renovation project. For the first few weeks, everything proceeded normally. I stripped wallpaper, updated electrical systems, and replaced flooring throughout the house without encountering anything unusual. The only odd detail I noticed was that my great-uncle had installed an unusually sophisticated security system for such a rural property, with cameras, motion sensors, and recording equipment that seemed excessive for a house in such a quiet area. When I asked other family members about it, they said Marcus had become increasingly concerned about intruders during his final years, though no one could recall any specific incidents that might have justified his concerns. The first sign that something was wrong came during my 4th weekend at the property. I was working late on Saturday night, refinishing hardwood floors in the master bedroom, when I began to hear what sounded like voices coming from other parts of the house. At first, I assumed the sounds were coming from outside, perhaps from neighbors or people on the road, but as I stopped work to listen more carefully, I realized that the voices were definitely coming from inside the house. The voices were indistinct and seemed to move from room to room, sometimes appearing to carry on conversations, while other times making sounds that resembled singing or chanting. I searched the entire house twice, checking every room, closet, and storage area, but found no source for the sounds and no evidence that anyone else was in the building. The voices continued intermittently throughout the night, always seeming to come from whichever room I was not currently occupying. The next morning, I reviewed the footage from my great-uncle's security cameras, hoping to find some explanation for what I had heard. The cameras had indeed captured audio throughout the night, confirming that the voices were real and not some kind of auditory hallucination. However, the video footage showed only me moving through the house, with no other people visible at any time. The voices on the audio tracks were clear and distinct, but they seemed to have no visible source. Even more disturbing was the content of some of the recorded conversations. While much of the audio was too indistinct to understand clearly, several passages contained what appeared to be detailed discussions of my renovation work, my family situation, and my plans for the property. The voices seemed to know things about my personal life and my intentions for the house that would not have been available to any outside observer. I decided to research my great-uncle's experiences at the property, starting with family members who might know more about his final years. What I discovered was that Marcus had indeed reported supernatural experiences at the house, but he had been reluctant to discuss them in detail because he was afraid other family members would think he was losing his mental faculties. According to my Aunt Patricia, Marcus had claimed that the Bell Witch had followed the family to the new property and had been tormenting him for decades. Marcus had apparently documented his experiences extensively, keeping detailed journals and audio recordings of the phenomena he encountered. After his death, the family had simply boxed up his personal papers without examining them closely, and they were still stored in the basement of the house. I spent an entire weekend going through these materials, and what I found was both fascinating and terrifying. The journals covered a period of more than 30 years and described experiences that were remarkably similar to the historical accounts of the original Bell Witch incidents. Marcus wrote about voices that would carry on conversations with him, objects that would move on their own, and physical attacks that left him with unexplained injuries. The entities seemed to have particular knowledge of Bell family history and would often reference events and people from the early 1800s that Marcus himself had never researched or learned about. Most disturbing were the audio recordings Marcus had made using the security system I had discovered. Hours and hours of tapes documented conversations between Marcus and an entity that claimed to be the same supernatural force that had tormented our ancestors 2 centuries earlier. The voice on the recordings was distinctly female, with a southern accent and speech patterns that seemed to reflect an earlier historical period. The entity referred to Marcus by name and demonstrated detailed knowledge of Bell family genealogy going back multiple generations. The conversations revealed that the entity had never actually left the Bell family, but had instead followed them through various relocations and property changes over the decades. According to the recordings, the Bell Witch had been dormant for long periods, but would become active whenever certain conditions were met, particularly when Bell family members returned to the original area where the incidents had first occurred. The entity seemed to have specific knowledge of my plans for the property and expressed strong opposition to my intention to sell the house to outsiders. During one particularly clear recording, the voice stated that the property would remain in Bell family hands regardless of my wishes, and that attempts to transfer ownership would result in consequences that I would not be able to ignore or resist. As I continued working on the renovation over the following weeks, my own experiences with the entity became more frequent and more intense. The voices that had initially appeared only at night began occurring during daylight hours as well. Objects would move when I was not looking. Tools would disappear and reappear in different locations, and I would frequently find my work undone or sabotaged in ways that required me to repeat entire projects. The entity also began to interact with me directly, calling my name and engaging in conversations that were recorded by the security system cameras. Unlike the historical accounts of the Bell Witch, which described a malevolent presence, my interactions with the entity were more like negotiations or discussions about the future of the property and my family's relationship with it. The entity claimed to have protective rather than harmful intentions, stating that it had been watching over the Bell family for generations and ensuring that we remained connected to our historical roots in Robertson County. According to the voice, the various supernatural incidents over the years had been attempts to keep the family from losing touch with their heritage and to prevent outsiders from gaining control of land that had been entrusted to our care. The most compelling evidence of the entity's reality came when I began involving other family members in documenting the experiences. My wife Sarah and daughter Emma visited the property several times during the renovation, and both of them witnessed and recorded interactions with the voice that demonstrated knowledge of Bell family history that none of us possessed. During one particularly remarkable session, the entity provided detailed information about John Bell's original land purchases in the early 1800s, including specific descriptions of property boundaries and legal documents that we were later able to verify through historical research at the Robertson County Courthouse. The entity also described locations of family artifacts and possessions that had been lost or forgotten for generations, several of which we actually found buried on the property exactly where the voice had indicated. The entity's knowledge extended to contemporary members of the Bell family as well, including relatives I had lost touch with over the years, and family history that had never been formally documented. When we followed up on some of this information, we discovered that the entity's statements about living family members and their current situations were accurate in ways that could not be explained through normal means. By October of 2023, I had abandoned my original plan to renovate and sell the property. The ongoing supernatural experiences had convinced me that the entity was genuinely connected to our family history and that the property represented something more significant than just a real estate investment. I also began to understand that my great-uncle Marcus had been serving as a caretaker for something that was important to our family's legacy, even if he had not always enjoyed the responsibility. Instead of selling the house, I decided to preserve it as a kind of family heritage site where future generations of Bell descendants could connect with their history and maintain the relationship with the entity that seemed to be such an important part of our family identity. I completed the renovation work, but I modified my plans to include accommodations for the supernatural aspects of the property, rather than trying to eliminate them. The house now serves as a gathering place for Bell family members from around the country, many of whom had never heard the complete story of our supernatural heritage. The entity seems to enjoy these family visits and often provides historical information and family stories that help us understand our connections to the original Bell family and the early settlement of Robertson County. I have also worked with paranormal researchers and historians to document the ongoing experiences at the property, contributing to scholarly understanding of supernatural phenomena that persist across multiple generations. The Bell Witch case is unique in American folklore because it involves a supernatural entity that has maintained continuous contact with the same family for more than 2 centuries, providing unprecedented opportunities for long-term study of paranormal activity. The modern technology available for documentation has allowed us to capture evidence that was not available to our ancestors in the early 1800s. High-definition audio and video recording equipment has documented interactions with the entity that provide clear evidence of intelligence, personality, and historical knowledge that cannot be easily explained through conventional means. The entity has also adapted to modern technology in interesting ways, learning to manipulate electronic devices and communication systems to facilitate interactions with family members. Text messages, phone calls, and even social media communications have been traced to the entity, suggesting that supernatural phenomena can evolve and adapt to changing technological environments. Perhaps most importantly, the ongoing relationship with the Bell Witch has helped our family understand that some historical events are not just stories to be preserved in books, but living connections to the past that continue to influence the present. The entity serves as a bridge between our family's history and its future, ensuring that important lessons and values are passed down through generations in ways that textbooks and family stories alone could never accomplish. The Bell Witch may have begun as a source of terror for our ancestors, but for the modern Bell family, it has become a guardian of our heritage and a unique connection to American history that few families can claim. The property on Bell Road remains in family hands, protected by both legal documents and supernatural oversight, ensuring that future generations will have access to their extraordinary legacy. My name is Jaelyn Morrison, and for 3 years I thought the Appalachian Trail would be my sanctuary. I was 29 years old when I started through hiking, attempting to complete the entire 290-mile journey from Georgia to Maine as a way to process the end of my marriage and figure out what I wanted to do with the rest of my life. I had always been an experienced backpacker, but I had never attempted anything as ambitious as hiking the complete trail system. The challenge seemed like exactly what I needed to clear my head and gain some perspective on my future. I started my through hike at Springer Mountain in Georgia in March of 2022, planning to reach Mount Katahdin in Maine sometime in early September, if I maintained the recommended pace of 15 to 20 miles per day. For the first few weeks, everything went better than I had expected. The trail was well maintained, the weather cooperated, and I quickly settled into the rhythm of daily hiking that would carry me through the southern states toward the more challenging terrain of Virginia and Pennsylvania. The Appalachian Trail attracts thousands of hikers every year, ranging from day trippers to serious through hikers attempting to complete the entire route. Most sections of the trail see regular traffic, and there is a strong culture of mutual support among the hiking community. Trail names, shelter registers, and informal networks of communication help solo hikers stay connected with others and maintain safety through shared information about trail conditions, weather, and potential hazards. This culture of community and mutual assistance was what made my encounter with the trail killer so shocking and unexpected. The person who attacked me was not some random predator who had stumbled onto the trail system, but someone who was intimately familiar with hiking culture and who used that knowledge to identify and target vulnerable victims. He understood the rhythms of through hiking, the locations where solo hikers were most isolated, and the trust that experienced hikers place in fellow members of the trail community. The first indication that something was wrong came during my second week in North Carolina, somewhere between Hot Springs and Irwin. I had been hiking alone for several days, having separated from a group of other through hikers who were moving at a slower pace than I preferred. This was common practice on the trail, where hikers frequently leapfrog past each other based on their individual schedules and hiking speeds. I expected to reconnect with other hikers at some point, but I was comfortable traveling solo for extended periods. On April 15th, I was approached by another hiker who introduced himself as Trail Dog, which is the kind of trail name that experienced hikers adopt to replace their legal names during the journey. Trail Dog appeared to be in his 40s, was carrying professional-grade equipment, and demonstrated extensive knowledge of the trail system and hiking protocols. He claimed to be attempting his third through hike and offered to share information about water sources, shelter availability, and trail conditions ahead. Trail Dog seemed knowledgeable and helpful, providing accurate information about the next few days of hiking and suggesting strategies for dealing with some challenging terrain that was coming up. He also carried detailed maps and guidebooks that showed intimate familiarity with the trail system. Based on his apparent experience and his willingness to share useful information, I accepted his offer to hike together for a few days, while our paths coincided. For the first day and a half, Trail Dog was an excellent hiking companion. He maintained a comfortable pace, shared interesting stories about his previous through hiking experiences, and demonstrated wilderness skills that confirmed his claimed expertise. He also seemed genuinely interested in helping me improve my own hiking techniques and avoid some of the common mistakes that can make long-distance hiking more difficult than necessary. The first sign that something might be wrong came on our second evening together, when we made camp at an isolated backcountry site several miles from the nearest road or shelter. Trail Dog had specifically suggested this location, claiming that it offered better water access and more privacy than the designated camping areas that most hikers preferred. At the time, his reasoning seemed sound, and I had no reason to question his judgment about camping locations. That evening, as we were preparing dinner, Trail Dog began asking increasingly personal questions about my hiking schedule, my planned route through the more remote sections of Virginia and West Virginia, and whether I was maintaining contact with friends or family during my through hike. His questions seemed casual at first, but they gradually became more focused on determining how closely my movements were being tracked and whether my disappearance would be quickly noticed. Trail Dog also began making comments about other hikers he had encountered, particularly women hiking alone, that made me increasingly uncomfortable. He described several female hikers in terms that suggested he had been observing them more closely than would be appropriate for normal trail interactions. He also mentioned having detailed information about the hiking schedules and planned routes of other solo hikers that he could not have acquired through casual conversation. On our third morning together, Trail Dog suggested that we take a side trail that would lead to a scenic overlook that was not mentioned in any of the standard trail guides. According to him, this detour would add only a few miles to our day and would provide spectacular views that most through hikers never had the opportunity to experience. The side trail was unmarked and appeared to be little more than an animal path, but Trail Dog claimed to have used it during previous through hikes. As we followed the side trail deeper into unmarked wilderness, I began to realize that Trail Dog had been deliberately leading me away from the main trail system and into an area where I would be completely isolated from other hikers. The path he was following did not appear on any of my maps, and it was leading us steadily away from the established trail corridor, rather than toward any legitimate scenic destination. When I questioned him about the route we were taking, Trail Dog became evasive and defensive, claiming that I was being unnecessarily suspicious and that his knowledge of alternative routes was superior to anything found in guidebooks or official trail maps. He also began making veiled threats about what might happen to hikers who wandered off established trails without proper guidance, suggesting that people who did not trust experienced hikers like himself often ended up lost or injured in the wilderness. As the morning progressed and we moved deeper into unmarked terrain, Trail Dog became increasingly agitated and aggressive. He began making explicit comments about his intentions toward me and describing in detail what he planned to do once we reached the isolated location he was leading me toward. He also revealed that he had been stalking and attacking solo hikers along various sections of the Appalachian Trail for several years, specifically targeting women who were hiking alone and could be separated from the main trail system. Trail Dog described a systematic pattern of behavior where he would identify vulnerable hikers, gain their trust by appearing to be an experienced and helpful trail companion, then lead them into isolated areas where he could attack them without risk of interference from other hikers. He claimed to have successfully attacked at least a dozen women over the past few years, and he described methods he used to dispose of evidence and avoid detection by law enforcement agencies. When I realized the full extent of the danger I was in, I began looking for opportunities to escape from Trail Dog and return to the main trail system. However, he had been carefully controlling our route to ensure that I would not be able to find my way back to the established trail without his guidance. The area we were in was densely forested, with no visible landmarks or clear sense of direction that would allow me to navigate back to safety independently. My opportunity came when Trail Dog stopped to consult his maps and GPS device, apparently trying to locate the specific site he had selected for his attack. While he was distracted with his navigation, I managed to grab my backpack and run into the forest in what I hoped was the direction of the main trail. I could hear him shouting behind me and crashing through the underbrush in pursuit, but the dense forest provided enough cover for me to avoid immediate capture. For the next several hours, I moved through the wilderness as quickly and quietly as possible, trying to put distance between myself and Trail Dog while searching for any indication of the main trail system. I was handicapped by unfamiliarity with the area and by the need to avoid making noise that might reveal my location to my pursuer. Several times I heard sounds that suggested he was still searching for me, including calls that mimicked distress signals that might have been designed to lure me into revealing my position. Eventually, I encountered a creek system that appeared to flow generally eastward toward the main trail corridor. I followed the creek for several miles, wading through the water to avoid leaving footprints that could be tracked, until I reached a point where the stream intersected with a marked trail that I was able to identify on my maps. From there, I was able to navigate back to the Appalachian Trail and reach a shelter where I could contact authorities and report what had happened. The investigation that followed revealed that the person calling himself Trail Dog was actually Robert James Mitchell, a 43-year-old man from Ohio who had been using the Appalachian Trail system as hunting grounds for attacking solo hikers for more than 5 years. Mitchell had extensive knowledge of the trail system and wilderness survival skills that allowed him to operate in remote areas without detection. He specifically targeted women hiking alone, using his apparent expertise and helpfulness to gain their trust before leading them into isolated areas where he could attack them. Law enforcement agencies from multiple states coordinated their investigation of Mitchell's activities, eventually linking him to at least 18 attacks on solo hikers along various sections of the Appalachian Trail and related trail systems throughout the eastern United States. 7 of his victims had been killed, while others had been sexually assaulted and left for dead in remote wilderness areas. Several of the attacks had been initially classified as hiking accidents or animal attacks because the crime scenes were in such isolated locations that evidence was contaminated or destroyed before investigations could begin properly. Mitchell had been using multiple false identities and trail names to avoid detection, and he possessed detailed knowledge of law enforcement procedures and search and rescue protocols that allowed him to avoid capture for extended periods. He had also been systematically studying the habits and schedules of thru hikers through online forums and social media, identifying potential victims, and planning his attacks well in advance of actually encountering them on the trail. The most disturbing aspect of Mitchell's crimes was the extent to which he had integrated himself into the hiking community to facilitate his predatory behavior. He attended trail festivals and hiking events, maintained active profiles on hiking websites and social media platforms, and had developed relationships with other hikers who had no idea of his criminal activities. He used these connections to gather intelligence about hiking schedules and to identify hikers who would be traveling alone through remote sections of the trail system. Mitchell was eventually arrested and charged with multiple counts of first-degree murder, sexual assault, and kidnapping across several state jurisdictions. The evidence against him included detailed journals describing his attacks, photographs of his victims, and physical evidence linking him to several crime scenes that had previously been classified as unsolved cases. He was convicted and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The investigation also revealed significant failures in communication between law enforcement agencies in different states, which had prevented authorities from recognizing the pattern of attacks along the trail system. As a result of Mitchell's crimes, new protocols were established for sharing information about crimes occurring in remote wilderness areas, and additional resources were allocated for patrolling the most isolated sections of the Appalachian Trail. The hiking community was also forced to confront the reality that their culture of trust and mutual assistance could be exploited by predators who understood how to manipulate the social dynamics of long-distance hiking. New safety protocols were developed for solo hikers, including recommendations for maintaining regular contact with family or friends, and for being cautious about sharing detailed itinerary information with other hikers encountered on the trail. My own recovery from the attack took several months of counseling and therapy to process the trauma of realizing how close I had come to becoming one of Mitchell's victims. I eventually completed my thru hike the following year, but the experience had permanently changed my relationship with solo hiking and wilderness travel. The knowledge that predators like Mitchell could be operating in areas that are supposed to represent freedom and natural beauty has made me much more cautious about trusting other hikers and much more aware of the need to maintain situational awareness, even in environments that seem safe and welcoming. The Appalachian Trail remains one of America's premier hiking destinations, but Mitchell's crimes serve as a reminder that even the most beautiful and peaceful locations can harbor dangers that are not immediately apparent. The trail community has worked hard to maintain its culture of mutual support and assistance, while also acknowledging the need for increased awareness of personal safety and security. The balance between trust and caution remains a challenge for anyone who chooses to venture into the wilderness, whether alone or with others. My name is Dion Walker, and I have spent the last 12 years investigating unexplained phenomena throughout the southeastern United States as a freelance paranormal researcher and documentary filmmaker. My specialty is documenting cases where multiple witnesses report consistent supernatural experiences over extended periods, particularly in areas where historical records support ongoing unexplained activity. In 2023, I was commissioned by a paranormal research organization to conduct a comprehensive investigation of the famous Brown Mountain Lights in North Carolina, a phenomenon that has been reported for more than a century, but never adequately explained or documented using modern equipment. Brown Mountain is located in the Blue Ridge Mountains of western North Carolina, approximately 20 miles northwest of Morganton. The mysterious lights that appear in the area have been described by witnesses since the early 1900s, and they have become one of the most famous unexplained phenomena in the Appalachian region. Dozens of theories have been proposed over the decades, ranging from natural electrical phenomena to reflections of automobile headlights, but none of the explanations have been able to account for all aspects of the reported sightings. The lights are typically described as spheres of glowing energy that appear above or around Brown Mountain, usually during clear evenings after dark. They vary in size from small points of light to orbs several feet in diameter, and they demonstrate behaviors that suggest intelligence or deliberate movement rather than random natural phenomena. Witnesses report that the lights can move rapidly across the mountain, disappear and reappear in different locations, and sometimes seem to respond to human presence by changing direction or intensity. I arrived in the Brown Mountain area in September of 2023, planning to spend 4 weeks documenting the phenomenon using high-definition cameras, electromagnetic field detectors, infrared imaging equipment, and other instruments that had not been available to previous investigators. I established a base camp at one of the designated viewing areas along the Blue Ridge Parkway, where I had unobstructed sightlines toward Brown Mountain and could monitor the area continuously for extended periods. For the first week of my investigation, I observed and recorded several instances of unexplained lights appearing in the vicinity of Brown Mountain. The lights matched the descriptions provided by previous witnesses, appearing as glowing orbs that moved in patterns that could not be explained by aircraft, vehicles, or known natural phenomena. My equipment captured clear video footage of the lights and documented electromagnetic anomalies that occurred in conjunction with their appearances. However, what I discovered during my second week of investigation was far more disturbing than simple unexplained lights. While reviewing footage from my infrared cameras, I noticed that some of the light phenomena were associated with human figures moving through the forest around Brown Mountain. These figures appeared to be carrying or emitting the lights, and they were moving through terrain that would be extremely difficult for normal hikers to navigate, especially in darkness. Further analysis of the infrared footage revealed that the human figures had physical characteristics that were inconsistent with normal human anatomy. They appeared to be significantly taller than average people, with limbs that were disproportionately long and movements that suggested extraordinary physical capabilities. Most disturbing of all, some of the figures appeared to be carrying objects that looked like they might be human bodies or unconscious people. I began to suspect that the famous Brown Mountain lights might be connected to criminal activity rather than supernatural phenomena. The lights could be serving as signals or markers for people engaged in illegal operations in the remote wilderness areas around the mountain. The difficult terrain and the public perception that any unusual activity was related to paranormal phenomena would provide excellent cover for criminal enterprises that required concealment from law enforcement. To test this theory, I expanded my investigation to include research into missing persons cases and unsolved crimes in the Brown Mountain area. What I discovered was a pattern of disappearances dating back more than 50 years, involving hikers, campers, and other visitors to the region who had vanished without explanation. Many of these cases had been attributed to accidents or voluntary disappearances, but the sheer number of incidents and the consistency of the circumstances suggested that something more systematic might be occurring. The missing persons cases showed several consistent elements that supported my theory about criminal activity. Most of the victims were solo travelers, or small groups visiting the area specifically to observe the mysterious lights. Many had been seen or spoken with by local residents shortly before their disappearances. often mentioning their intention to hike into remote areas around Brown Mountain for better viewing positions. Several had been carrying valuable equipment, including cameras, camping gear, and electronic devices that would be attractive to thieves. Most disturbing was evidence that some of the victims had been in contact with local residents who claimed to have special knowledge about the best locations for observing the lights. Several missing persons had mentioned meeting helpful locals who offered to guide them to optimal viewing positions that were not accessible to general tourists. These guides seemed to have intimate knowledge of the terrain and the patterns of light activity, but they were never identified or located by investigators working the missing persons cases. I decided to pose as a tourist, interested in observing the Brown Mountain lights, hoping to make contact with these mysterious local guides and document their activities. I spread word through local businesses and online forums that I was seeking experienced guides who could take me to the best viewing locations, especially areas that were not crowded with other tourists. Within a few days, I was contacted by a man who claimed to have been studying the lights for decades and offered to show me locations where they could be observed and photographed more easily than from the standard public viewing areas. The guide, who identified himself only as Carl, met me at a predetermined location along a back road near Brown Mountain on October 7th. Carl appeared to be in his 50s, was familiar with the local terrain, and carried equipment that suggested extensive experience with wilderness navigation. He claimed to have been documenting the lights for more than 20 years and offered to share locations that he had discovered through systematic observation and exploration of the area around the mountain. Carl led me along unmarked trails into areas that were significantly more remote than the standard tourist viewing locations. As we hiked deeper into the wilderness, he provided detailed information about the patterns and behaviors of the lights, including specific times and locations where they were most likely to appear. His knowledge seemed genuine and was consistent with the historical accounts I had researched, but I began to notice that he was leading me steadily away from any areas where we might encounter other people. After hiking for approximately 2 hours, we reached a clearing on a ridge that offered an excellent view of Brown Mountain and the surrounding valley. Carl explained that this location was one of his favorite observation points because it was isolated from light pollution and provided unobstructed sight lines in multiple directions. He also mentioned that the lights seemed to respond more actively to human presence in this particular area, sometimes approaching within a few hundred yards of observers. As darkness fell, we did indeed begin to observe unexplained lights moving around Brown Mountain. The phenomena were more active and more varied than anything I had witnessed from the standard viewing areas, with multiple lights appearing simultaneously and demonstrating coordinated movements that suggested some kind of intelligence or control. Carl seemed to be anticipating the appearances of specific lights, occasionally pointing to areas where lights would appear several minutes before they actually became visible. However, I also began to notice other activities in the area that were not related to the unexplained lights. Human figures were moving through the forest below our observation point, using handheld lights and what appeared to be night vision equipment to navigate through the darkness. These people were clearly engaged in some kind of organized activity, moving in groups and communicating through what appeared to be radio or electronic communication devices. When I mentioned the human activity to Carl, he became evasive and suggested that we relocate to a different observation point where we would have better views of the phenomenon. However, his proposed route would take us directly toward the area where I had observed the suspicious human activity. I began to suspect that Carl was not simply a fellow researcher interested in documenting unexplained phenomena, but someone who was connected to whatever illegal operations were taking place in the Brown Mountain area. As we prepared to move to the new location, I excused myself to retrieve equipment from my backpack and used the opportunity to activate a GPS emergency beacon that would alert authorities to my location and situation. I also used a satellite communication device to send a brief message to my research team, alerting them to my concerns about the situation and providing my current coordinates. Carl became increasingly insistent that we needed to move to the new observation location immediately, claiming that the lights were most active during a specific time window that we would miss if we delayed much longer. His urgency seemed inconsistent with the patient observation approach he had described earlier, and I began to suspect that his real intention was to lead me to a location where I would be more vulnerable to whatever criminal operation was taking place in the area. When I expressed reluctance to leave our current position, Carl became openly hostile and revealed that he was carrying a weapon. He informed me that I had seen too much of the activities around Brown Mountain and that I would not be leaving the area. He also revealed that he and his associates had been using the cover of the famous lights phenomenon to conduct kidnapping and human trafficking operations for years, targeting isolated tourists and researchers who came to the area specifically to investigate the unexplained phenomena. According to Carl, the criminal organization had been operating in the Brown Mountain area for more than a decade, using the remote terrain and the public focus on supernatural explanations to conceal their activities from law enforcement. They specifically targeted people who came to the area alone or in small groups, particularly those who were carrying valuable equipment or who had significant financial resources. The victims were either killed immediately or transported to other locations where they could be held for ransom or sold into various forms of exploitation. Carl explained that the organization had deliberately fostered and maintained the mysterious reputation of the Brown Mountain Lights as a way of attracting potential victims to the area. They used local accomplices to spread stories about the phenomena and to identify tourists who might be suitable targets. The lights themselves were a combination of natural phenomena and artificial signals used by the criminal organization to coordinate their operations and communicate with different groups working in the area. The confrontation with Carl was interrupted by the arrival of law enforcement officers who had responded to my emergency beacon and satellite communication. Multiple agencies, including local sheriff's departments, state police, and federal agents, had been coordinating a response to my situation and had positioned teams throughout the area in case of emergency. The GPS coordinates I had provided allowed them to locate and approach our position without alerting Carl or his associates to their presence. Carl was arrested along with 6 other individuals who were operating in the Brown Mountain area that night. The investigation that followed revealed an extensive criminal operation that had been responsible for numerous disappearances and murders over a period of more than 15 years. The organization had been using the remote wilderness areas around Brown Mountain as a base for kidnapping, human trafficking, and other criminal activities, specifically targeting tourists and researchers who visited the area to observe the famous lights. The evidence recovered during the investigation included detailed records of victims, financial transactions related to ransom payments and human trafficking, and equipment used to create artificial light displays that supplemented the natural phenomena and served as communication signals for the criminal organization. The investigation also revealed connections to similar operations in other areas of the southeastern United States where unexplained phenomena were used to attract and isolate potential victims. Law enforcement agencies have since increased patrols and monitoring in the Brown Mountain area, and new safety protocols have been established for researchers and tourists who wish to observe the lights phenomenon. The criminal organization's activities had been hidden for so long, partly because many of their victims were people who had come to the area specifically to investigate unexplained phenomena, and their disappearances were often attributed to accidents or voluntary departures rather than criminal activity. The actual Brown Mountain Lights phenomenon continues to occur and remains unexplained despite the resolution of the criminal activities that had been associated with it. My investigation confirmed that there are indeed genuine, unexplained light phenomena in the area that cannot be attributed to human activity or conventional natural causes. However, the criminal organization had been deliberately exploiting public interest in the mysterious lights to facilitate their illegal operations. The case serves as a reminder that even areas known for supernatural or unexplained phenomena can harbor very real and dangerous criminal activities. The isolation that makes such locations attractive for paranormal research can also make them appealing to criminals who need to operate away from law enforcement scrutiny. Future researchers investigating unexplained phenomena in remote areas should maintain appropriate security protocols and maintain regular contact with law enforcement agencies to ensure their safety while conducting their work. My documentary about the Brown Mountain investigation has been used by law enforcement training programs to illustrate how criminal organizations can exploit public interest in paranormal phenomena to conceal illegal activities. The case has also contributed to improved coordination between paranormal researchers and law enforcement agencies, helping to ensure that legitimate scientific investigation can continue while maintaining appropriate security measures to protect researchers and the general public. My name is Kendricks Thompson, and for 8 years I worked as a social worker for the West Virginia Department of Health and Human Services, specializing in child welfare cases in the remote mountain communities of Raleigh County. The job required me to conduct home visits in some of the most isolated areas of Appalachian, West Virginia, where families lived in conditions that often challenged my understanding of how people could survive in modern America. I thought I had seen every form of poverty, neglect, and family dysfunction that existed in these mountains, until I discovered what was happening in a hidden valley that locals called Devil's Holler. The case began in March of 2023, when I received a referral from a teacher at the county elementary school who had concerns about 3 children from the same family who had suddenly stopped attending classes. The Whitfield children, ranging in age from 6 to 12 years old, had been irregular attendees throughout the school year, but their complete absence for more than 2 weeks had triggered the mandatory reporting requirements that brought the case to my attention. The teacher reported that the children had appeared malnourished and showed signs of possible physical abuse during their time at school. When I attempted to make contact with the Whitfield family at the address listed in school records, I discovered that the location was a post office box in the small town of Beckley, about 30 miles from where the children had been attending school. The postal clerk informed me that the box had been rented by someone claiming to represent a religious community that lived in the mountains, but no specific street address had been provided. The rental agreement listed only a general description of property located up Crows Creek Road past the bridge. I spent 2 days driving the back roads and creek beds around Beckley, asking local residents about the Whitfield family and any religious communities in the area. Most people claimed no knowledge of either, but I detected a reluctance to discuss certain areas of the mountains that suggested they knew more than they were willing to share. Finally, an elderly man at a country store gave me directions to what he called the compound up in Devil's Holler, warning me that the people there did not welcome outsiders and that I should not go there alone. Following the directions I had been given, I drove up a narrow gravel road that wound through increasingly dense forest for almost 10 miles before reaching a locked gate with posted signs warning against trespassing. The signs mentioned private property and religious sanctuary, but they also included threatening language about the consequences of unauthorized entry that seemed inconsistent with normal religious communities. I parked my state vehicle outside the gate and walked up the road on foot, hoping to make contact with someone who could provide information about the children I was investigating. The compound I discovered beyond the gate was unlike anything I had encountered during my years of social work in rural communities. A collection of makeshift buildings and trailers was arranged around a central meeting hall, with the entire complex surrounded by high fencing that appeared designed to keep people in rather than simply marking property boundaries. Gardens and livestock areas suggested self-sufficiency, but the overall impression was of a community that had deliberately isolated itself from outside contact and oversight. As I approached the central area of the compound, I was met by several adult men who demanded to know my business and threatened to have me arrested for trespassing on private property. When I identified myself as a social worker investigating concerns about children who had stopped attending school, their hostility intensified rather than diminishing. They claimed no knowledge of any children named Whitfield and insisted that I leave the property immediately or face physical removal. However, while arguing with the men, I observed clear evidence that children were living on the compound. Clothing hanging on lines, toys scattered in yards, and playground equipment visible behind some of the buildings indicated the presence of numerous children, despite the men's denials. I also noticed that some of the women and children who were visible in the distance appeared to be watching our confrontation with expressions of fear rather than curiosity, suggesting that my presence represented some kind of threat to their situation. When I refused to leave without conducting the welfare check that was required by law, the men became physically aggressive and escorted me back to the gate while making threats about what would happen if I returned without a warrant. Their behavior was consistent with people who had something to hide, rather than a legitimate religious community that was simply protective of their privacy. I documented everything I had observed and immediately contacted the Raleigh County Sheriff's Department to request assistance with the investigation. Sheriff's deputies who accompanied me on a return visit the next day found that the compound had been largely abandoned overnight, with most of the residents having apparently fled to unknown locations. However, evidence left behind suggested that a much larger community had been living there than the few men who had confronted me the previous day. Personal belongings, food supplies, and living arrangements indicated that dozens of people, including many children, had been residing in conditions that raised serious concerns about their welfare and safety. More disturbing were indications that the compound had been used for activities that went far beyond unconventional religious practices. Documents found in the meeting hall included materials related to child marriage, polygamy, and forms of physical punishment that would constitute abuse under West Virginia law. Financial records suggested that the community had been generating income through illegal activities, including benefit fraud, tax evasion, and possibly human trafficking. The investigation that followed involved multiple law enforcement agencies and child protective services from several states, as evidence suggested that the community had connections to similar compounds in Kentucky, Virginia, and Tennessee. The group appeared to be part of a larger network of isolated communities that used religious justification to conceal systematic abuse of children and exploitation of vulnerable adults. Over the following weeks, law enforcement agencies tracked down most of the people who had fled the compound, including the 3 Whitfield children whose absence from school had triggered the original investigation. What we discovered about their living conditions and experiences was among the most disturbing cases I encountered during my career in child welfare. The children had been subjected to systematic physical and sexual abuse, forced labor, and educational neglect that had left them severely traumatized and developmentally delayed. The adults who had been controlling the compound were part of a polygamous sect that had broken away from mainstream religious organizations decades earlier. They had established remote communities throughout the Appalachian region where they could practice their beliefs without interference from authorities. But their interpretation of religious freedom had evolved into a system that facilitated serious crimes against children and vulnerable adults. The leader of the group, a man named Samuel Ezra Whitfield, who claimed to be the father of dozens of children in the community, had been using religious doctrine to justify practices that included child marriage, sexual abuse, forced labor, and complete isolation from the outside world. Children in the community were denied access to education, medical care, and contact with relatives who might have questioned their treatment. The investigation revealed that similar compounds had been operating throughout the region for years, taking advantage of the isolation and limited law enforcement presence in remote mountain areas to avoid detection. The communities moved frequently when they suspected that authorities were becoming aware of their activities, which explained why the compound had been abandoned so quickly after my initial visit. Most of the children rescued from the compound required extensive medical and psychological treatment to address the trauma they had experienced and the developmental delays caused by educational neglect. Many had never been to a doctor or dentist, had received no formal education, and had been completely isolated from mainstream society. The process of helping them adapt to normal living conditions took years and required specialized resources that were not readily available in rural West Virginia. The adults who had been controlling the compound were charged with numerous crimes, including child abuse, sexual assault, kidnapping, and violations of federal laws related to human trafficking. Samuel Ezra Whitfield received multiple life sentences for his role in organizing and directing the systematic abuse of children over a period of more than 20 years. The case also revealed significant failures in systems that should have protected the children much earlier. The sect had been able to avoid oversight by moving frequently, using false identities, and exploiting gaps in communication between different jurisdictions and agencies. Children had been withdrawn from school systems without proper follow-up, and concerns raised by teachers and healthcare providers had not been adequately investigated due to resource limitations and jurisdictional complications. As a result of this case and similar discoveries in other states, new protocols were established for tracking children who are withdrawn from public education and for coordinating investigations that cross jurisdictional boundaries. Training programs were also developed to help social workers and law enforcement officers recognize signs of organized abuse and exploitation in isolated communities. The compound in Devil's Holler was eventually demolished, and the property was seized by the state as evidence of criminal activity. However, the investigation revealed that similar communities continue to operate in remote areas throughout Appalachia, taking advantage of the isolation and limited resources available for monitoring and intervention in rural communities. The experience changed my understanding of how predators can exploit religious freedom and parental rights to create situations where systematic abuse can continue for years without detection. The isolation that characterizes many Appalachian communities, which is often seen as a positive aspect of mountain culture, can also provide cover for activities that would be quickly identified and stopped in more connected areas. I continue to work in child welfare, but I now focus on training other social workers to recognize signs of organized abuse and to understand the special challenges involved in protecting children in isolated communities. The case also reinforced my belief that no form of religious or cultural practice should be allowed to override the basic rights of children to safety, education, and protection from exploitation. The children who were rescued from the compound have had varying degrees of success in adapting to life outside the sect. Some have been able to pursue education and build relationships with foster families or relatives, while others continue to struggle with the psychological trauma of their early experiences. All of them carry scars from their time in Devil's Holler that will affect them for the rest of their lives. The case serves as a reminder that, even in modern America, there are still places where children can be completely cut off from the protections that most of us take for granted. The mountains of Appalachia, with their traditions of independence and distrust of outside authority, can provide refuge for both those seeking legitimate privacy and those seeking to hide criminal activities from law enforcement and social services. My name is Jaelyn Foster, and for the past 5 years I have worked as a professional wildlife photographer, specializing in documenting rare and endangered species throughout the southeastern United States. My work has taken me into some of the most remote wilderness areas in the region, from the Everglades of Florida to the high peaks of North Carolina, but nowhere have I encountered anything as disturbing as what I discovered in a section of the Cherokee National Forest in Tennessee during the autumn of 2023. I had been commissioned by National Geographic to document the recovery of elk populations in the southern Appalachians, a conservation success story that had seen these magnificent animals return to their native habitat after being absent for more than a century. The project required me to spend several weeks in extremely remote areas of the Cherokee National Forest, using trail cameras and long-lens photography to capture images of elk behavior without disturbing their natural patterns. The section of forest I was assigned to cover encompassed approximately 50 square miles of mountainous terrain near the North Carolina border, an area so isolated that it received fewer than a dozen human visitors per year. The nearest road was more than 10 miles from my primary research area, and cell phone coverage was non-existent throughout most of the region. This isolation was exactly what made it ideal habitat for elk recovery, but it also meant that I was completely cut off from outside contact for days at a time. For the first 3 weeks of my assignment, everything proceeded according to plan. I documented several elk herds, captured photographs of successful breeding behavior, and gathered evidence of healthy population growth that would support continued conservation efforts. The elk appeared to be thriving in their restored habitat, and I was optimistic about the success of the reintroduction program. However, during my 4th week in the forest, I began to notice disturbing changes in the behavior of all wildlife in the area. The elk herds that I had been tracking suddenly became extremely skittish and began avoiding areas where they had previously been comfortable grazing. Other animals, including deer, bears, and smaller mammals, also showed signs of unusual stress and appeared to be fleeing the area entirely. Most concerning was the complete disappearance of bird activity from large sections of the forest. Areas that had previously been filled with the sounds of various songbirds, woodpeckers, and raptors became eerily silent, as if all avian life had simultaneously decided to abandon the region. This kind of sudden, widespread change in animal behavior is typically associated with major environmental disturbances such as forest fires, chemical contamination, or seismic activity. But I could find no evidence of any such problems. My trail cameras, which had been consistently capturing images of diverse wildlife throughout my assignment, suddenly stopped recording any animal activity at all in certain areas of the forest. When I checked the cameras, I found that they were functioning properly and had adequate battery power, but the memory cards showed nothing but empty forest for days at a time. It was as if every living creature had simultaneously evacuated specific sections of the wilderness. While reviewing the trail camera footage more carefully, I discovered something that made me deeply concerned for my own safety. Several cameras had captured images of what appeared to be human figures moving through the forest during nighttime hours, but these figures displayed movement patterns and physical characteristics that were inconsistent with normal human behavior. They moved through dense underbrush and steep terrain with impossible speed and agility, and they appeared to be significantly larger than average people. More disturbing were images that showed these figures interacting with wildlife in ways that defied explanation. In one sequence, a figure was captured approaching a deer that had become trapped in thick undergrowth. Instead of freeing the animal or being frightened away by human presence, the deer appeared to become completely motionless, as if paralyzed by fear or some other influence. The sequence ended with both the figure and the deer disappearing from the camera's field of view. I also discovered evidence of what appeared to be feeding sites scattered throughout the forest. areas where large amounts of animal remains had been collected and arranged in patterns that suggested deliberate organization, rather than natural predation or scavenging. The remains included bones from elk, deer, bears, and smaller mammals, but they had been stripped of flesh so completely and efficiently that no insects or other scavengers were present, which is highly unusual in forest environments. These feeding sites were located in areas that showed signs of regular use over extended periods, with well-worn paths leading between them and evidence of some kind of systematic processing of animal remains. The sites were also associated with strange markings on nearby trees, deep scratches and gouges that appeared to have been made by claws or tools much larger and sharper than anything possessed by known wildlife in the region. As I continued my investigation of these disturbing discoveries, I began to notice that my own presence in the forest was being monitored by whatever entities were responsible for the animal disappearances. My equipment was being subtly rearranged when I was away from my campsite, and I would frequently find evidence that someone or something had been examining my cameras, backpack, and other gear during the night. Most unsettling were the sounds I began to hear during nighttime hours. Calls that resembled elk vocalizations, but were wrong in ways that suggested they were being produced by something other than actual elk. These false elk calls seemed to be attempts to lure me away from my campsite and into areas of the forest where I would be more vulnerable to whatever was producing them. I also began to experience physical symptoms that suggested some kind of environmental contamination or exposure to unknown substances. Persistent headaches, nausea, and disorientation became increasingly severe during my final week in the forest, and I noticed that my normal physical endurance was significantly reduced. These symptoms were similar to those associated with certain types of poisoning or exposure to toxins, but I could identify no source of contamination in my food, water, or equipment. My investigation eventually led me to a section of the forest that showed clear evidence of being deliberately avoided by all wildlife. This area, encompassing perhaps 5 square miles of mountainous terrain, was completely devoid of normal forest sounds and contained numerous dead trees that appeared to have been killed by some unknown agent. The soil in this area had an unusual color and texture, and it produced a faint but persistent odor that reminded me of decomposing organic matter. At the center of this dead zone, I discovered what appeared to be the source of the environmental contamination that was affecting the entire region. A natural cave system had been expanded and modified into an extensive underground complex, with multiple entrances and ventilation shafts that allowed air and fluid circulation throughout the mountain. The entrances were partially concealed by rock formations and vegetation, but careful observation revealed evidence of regular traffic and maintenance. The area around the cave entrances showed signs of intensive activity over an extended period. Large quantities of animal bones and remains were scattered throughout the vicinity, and the ground was worn smooth by the passage of heavy objects or large numbers of individuals. Most disturbing were the organic stains and deposits that covered rocks and vegetation near the cave entrances, suggesting that some kind of processing or consumption activities were taking place underground. When I attempted to explore one of the smaller cave entrances, I encountered an atmosphere that was toxic enough to cause immediate respiratory distress and disorientation. The air inside the cave system contained high concentrations of hydrogen sulfide and other gases associated with decomposition processes, but in quantities that suggested industrial-scale organic matter processing rather than natural decay. I was forced to retreat from the cave entrance after only a few minutes due to the toxic atmosphere, but I was able to capture photographs and air samples that provided evidence of the environmental contamination that was affecting the entire region. The toxic gases emanating from the cave system were clearly responsible for the wildlife die-offs and behavioral changes I had observed throughout the forest. However, the most disturbing discovery was that the cave system showed clear evidence of deliberate modification and expansion by intelligent agents. Tool marks on rock surfaces, engineered ventilation systems, and constructed drainage channels indicated that whatever was using the underground complex possessed advanced problem-solving abilities and the capacity for long-term planning and construction projects. As I prepared to leave the area and report my findings to environmental authorities, I encountered direct evidence that my presence in the forest was no longer being tolerated by whatever entities controlled the cave system. My campsite was systematically destroyed during my final night in the area, with equipment scattered and damaged in ways that suggested both intelligence and considerable physical strength. More threatening were the sounds that surrounded my position throughout the night, vocalizations that resembled human speech, but were distorted in ways that made them incomprehensible. These sounds seemed to be coordinated communications between multiple individuals positioned around my campsite, suggesting that I was being surrounded by organized entities that were discussing my situation and possibly planning some kind of action against me. I abandoned my remaining equipment and hiked out of the forest as quickly as possible, covering the 10-mile distance to the nearest road in less than 4 hours, despite difficult terrain and my deteriorating physical condition. The urgency of my retreat was motivated by a growing conviction that I had stumbled upon something that posed a direct threat to my survival, and that my continued presence in the area would result in serious harm. The environmental testing I conducted on the air and soil samples I had collected confirmed the presence of toxic compounds in concentrations that posed serious health risks to humans and wildlife. The contamination appeared to be the result of large-scale decomposition processes occurring underground, producing gases and chemical byproducts that were being released into the forest environment through the cave system. However, the most disturbing aspect of the laboratory results was evidence that the decomposition processes were not occurring naturally. The chemical signatures and isotopic ratios in my samples suggested that organic matter was being processed using methods that accelerated decay rates far beyond what would occur through normal biological processes. This indicated the use of advanced techniques or substances that were not consistent with any known natural phenomena. My report to the Tennessee Department of Environment and Conservation resulted in a temporary closure of the affected area while environmental specialists conducted their own investigation. However, when the official team arrived at the coordinates I had provided, they found no evidence of the cave system or environmental contamination I had described. The dead zone I had discovered appeared to have returned to normal forest conditions, and wildlife activity had resumed throughout the area. The official investigation concluded that my reports were the result of stress-induced hallucinations and environmental misinterpretation caused by prolonged isolation in wilderness conditions. The symptoms I had experienced were attributed to altitude sickness and dehydration, and the unusual animal behavior I had documented was explained as normal seasonal migration patterns. Despite the official dismissal of my findings, I remain convinced that I encountered something in the Cherokee National Forest that posed a genuine threat to both environmental and human safety. The systematic nature of the wildlife disappearances, the evidence of intelligent modification of the cave system, and the organized response to my presence all suggest that something was actively controlling that section of forest for purposes that were inconsistent with natural ecological processes. I have not returned to the Cherokee National Forest since my 2023 assignment, and I have declined subsequent photography projects that would require extended periods alone in remote wilderness areas. The knowledge that there are places in our national forests where unknown entities operate according to their own agenda has fundamentally changed my relationship with wilderness photography and outdoor recreation. The Cherokee National Forest remains open to public recreation, but I continue to monitor reports of unusual wildlife behavior, environmental contamination, and unexplained phenomena in the region. The mountains of Appalachia have always harbored mysteries and dangers that are not fully understood by modern science, and my experience suggests that some of those mysteries may represent active threats that require much more serious attention than they currently receive.